time to give us his presentation. So I would like to introduce today Herbert Chase. He is a kidney specialist and informatician, and he is involved in several research projects that explore the development and potential integration of artificial intelligence into electronic medical records. And he does it to improve medical practice. And previously, he also served as a medical advisor to IBM and was involved in the development of the medical version of Watson. And he will lecture on clinical decision support, and we are very excited to have you.
Great. Well, thank you all. I hope you're all well. It's a very exciting time to be in clinical decision support. I'll start the lecture in a second. But in preparing for this, even though I've given this lecture 12 years in a row or something like that, I always like to see what's new. And there's been an explosion of startups and academic development of decision support. It's very exciting. We've seen the medical students are very interested in, some of them are thinking about, not practicing medicine and going to a startup. But the idea of being able to leverage best practices through decision support is very appealing. So let me share my screen. And I assume if you can't see it, let me know. Everybody can see that? Good. I'm going to first start saying I don't have industry conflicts. I do advise startups on occasion, but I don't have any financial interest. Just try to steer them in the right direction. Let's go over today's learning objectives. By the end of this talk, I hope that you'd be able to define clinical decision support, discuss why support is needed, provide examples of successful clinical decision support tools, and we have many examples. I had to choose from dozens of really good examples, and end with what really bothers me about decision support and things that I'm worried about. That will be the final third of the talk. So why do we need clinical decision support? And this is somewhat like a report card for us in medicine. First of all, safety is a major concern. Medical error. Every time I see this, I actually can't believe it. Medical error is the third leading cause of death in the US. There's cancer, there's heart disease, and there's medical error. And adverse drug events, according to the FDA, is the fourth leading cause of death. So there's a lot of hope that decision support can improve safety. So that's one reason. Diagnosis, it's often delayed, it's wrong, it's missed. I'm sure during your lifetime, you've met a family member or a friend whose diagnosis of a particular condition went undiagnosed for years, literally in some cases. Evidence-based management. There are a lot of studies showing that as providers, we see a patient in a clinic, and we have all these questions that we need to answer, and we don't have time to answer, even though we know that we should. And there are studies showing that if you actually allow a provider to look up the answer to their question, it changes the therapy. We don't follow guidelines, not because we're bad people. It's just no amount of time that where we can find all the answers and follow the guidelines. And lastly, cognitive challenges. This one is of particular interest to me. We actually have a whole session on this with medical students, but we're subject to cognitive overload. I'm going to show you a screenshot of an electronic health record. There's so many pieces of information that it is not humanly possible to keep track of all of them. And even more subversive are clinical reasoning biases. That our reasoning is just sends us in the wrong direction. A simple example is humans tend to overestimate risk or underestimate risk, and that affects the way they manage patients. That's the great thing about computers, is theoretically it will know what the actual risk is and won't underestimate or overestimate. So let's look to see what the most important reason in my own mind of why we need decision support is that the electronic health record is the only entity that has the patient's complete story. Patients go to one specialist, they go to another. There's no such thing as the primary care doc who knows everything about everything. And it ends up that the electronic health record is the one place where the entire history and all the data of a particular patient is available. And we consider the patient who's got multiple sclerosis. They might complain to their primary provider that they have headaches. They may complain to their OBGYN that suddenly that bladder leakage. They might go to their ophthalmologist and say they have double vision, and they might go to their physical therapist and say that they've got leg weakness. And all this adds up to is multiple sclerosis, all four of those signs and symptoms. But each of those entities, the ophthalmologist or the physical therapist, is unlikely to come to that diagnosis because they don't have access or can't easily access all the records. And so one hope, I'm going to talk about multiple sclerosis later in this talk, one hope is that the electronic record, having all the history, is going to be able to find the best diagnosis and therapies for patients. So let's talk about what the opportunities are. This is a clinical encounter. For those of you who are not in medicine, a patient comes in with a history of the physical. The provider has a working diagnosis, does some testing, has to interpret the test, then imparts on some therapy or at least plan. And there are a couple of skills here that are important: diagnostic reasoning, decision analysis, interpreting the test. All of these can be done by a computer, probably in some cases better than we. As I mentioned, there are cognitive errors which undermine the reasoning, and a decision support system can improve on these skills. It can make the diagnoses more timely and more accurate, and it can also come up with better evidence-based therapy. And as already mentioned, it can provide a bias-free approach. So there's many opportunities in this basic paradigm of how we practice medicine. I want to make a distinction between clinical support and clinical decision support. And I do so because there's a backlash of middle-aged to older physicians who really, in some cases, either ignore or don't trust decision support tools because they're part of the old system where they made all the decisions, and they are leery of being, quote, told. As you'll hear later, I don't believe that that's the purpose of decision support. They've been told what to do. And I do make a distinction between clinical support, which I think everybody would accept, which is the idea that a provider is capable of making the best decision, but lacks the time or information necessary to do so. I mean, I can apply the guideline in order to manage someone's disease. I just going to have to spend 2 hours trying to find that guideline. It's not that I can't do that, but I could do it if I needed to. And then there's decision support, real decision support, where the provider is not capable of making the best decision due to the complexity of integrating all the details. I mean, you'll hear me talk a little bit later about predictive modeling. Human can't be a predictor of outcomes, based on 3 attributes. A computer can, because it can develop a tool to make a prediction based on hundreds of attributes. So I keep this distinction in mind when I give you some examples of decision support and clinical decision support and clinical support. Just to give a little picture of how this is conceptualized. In clinical support, we have a very simple interface engine with rules, and we could employ those, we could follow on those rules. They're not hard to understand. It could be looking at drugs, whether or not they interact in a drug-drug table. But then there's decision support in which an algorithm is involved, and the algorithm helps develop the model that is going to improve care. I'm going to come back to this slide later on in this talk. So let's discuss some examples. And again, I've divided into clinical support. We can do all these things, but we like to have a computer do it because it's a lot faster. And I'm not sure we can do all these things all that well. And we need a computer to help us with that. So let's talk about some of the successes. Prompts That's an easy one. The machine sends out a prompt. HPV vaccine, the papillomavirus vaccine, very effective at preventing cervical cancer. We found, or the medical people found, that the vaccine was underutilized. One of the institutions, I forgot where this was, they put in a prompt. And so if the patient's the right age, the prompt pops up in the physician's space, and that was very successful. The vaccine rate went way up. So we need prompts. You know, we can't remember everything, and we'll get to the downside of prompts a little bit later on. Missing key values, checklists. I don't know if any of you or all of you read the Checklist Manifesto by Atul Gawande, a brilliant book, really entertaining. And his basic conclusion is really smart people forget to do things. And so we need checklists. I've had colleagues who are phenomenal diagnosticians and brilliant doctors forget to do something like treat somebody's cholesterol because it just fell off their page. So it's good to have checklists for various things. The OR has checklists. This is just one example of a patient with kidney disease. You're going to hear a lot of kidney examples, as you heard. I'm a kidney doctor. And it's just a reminder of what you haven't ordered, and you should, rather than have to think about this on your own. How about modifying the drug dose? Modifications, aminoglycosides and kidney disease. These drugs will cause kidney damage if you don't modify the dose. Why? You can do the math yourself if you want to go Google it, but it's much easier to have a decision support tool that does the calculation for you. You put in what the kidney function is, it tells you what the dose is. Drug-drug interactions. I already mentioned that drug-drug interactions are a major cause of morbidity and mortality. Basically, the average number of drugs a patient over 65 takes is 5, and that was from 5 years ago. It's probably 7 now. There are a lot of interactions, and this is a snapshot of EPIC, our EHR, and the patient is on all these drugs: warfarin, amiodarone, dabigatran, and the warning is flashed. There's this interaction, there's warfarin, amiodarone, and that interaction, and whatever the severity is also indicated by a little icon here, very high severity or high severity. It so happens, we'll talk later, that a lot of these warnings are ignored for reasons that have never made sense to me. But the point is, I could find those warnings by going to drugs.com. There's an engine there, but I'd much rather have the prompt right there when I'm seeing the patient. Medical history. In the old days, we'd be on call. We'd have a volume number 32 or volume number 33. It'd be the middle of the night. We'd say to the unit clerk, where are the other 32 volumes of the patient's record? We know that it's important. There's got to be stuff in there that's important. And they would say, we don't have it. It's off-site being stored someplace. Now we have the opposite problem, which is, we have the opposite problem, which is there's too much information in the electronic health record. All 32 volumes are stored in that patient's record. Hundreds, if not thousands of lab data, hundreds of notes and reports, complicated medical histories, procedures and devices that need to be monitored. How do we deal with that? You could say to a medical student, I want you to spend the next month reading over the patient's entire chart. Yeah, they could figure out all the things that are wrong with the patient and what's been done, but it would take many days of diligent work, probably fraught with some error. So there's a great effort to find ways to computationally create summaries. This was created by my colleague, Noam El-Haddad, who, along with a medical student, developed a simple way to communicate to the reader what the important problems are of this patient, and did it through word cloud. The machine reads every single note in that patient's chart and then picks out the terms that are used the most, which theoretically represent the most important aspects of the patient history. Obviously, lupus is big here. It means the patient has lupus, and then I can look at this and say, oh yeah, well, they probably have lupus of the brain, they have lupus in the kidney, and that's causing nephrotic syndrome. The point is that that whole history has been summarized in one snapshot. It's incredibly helpful. This is Epic, our new version of Epic, and you can see it's a little bit clunkier. It doesn't have the same pizzazz as the word cloud, but it's a little more specific. It's got the medication list. It's got the problem list from the hospital, admission, non-hospital. So we have machines summarizing the patient's record, something that we could do, but we can't do it in a reasonable amount of time. I'm so sorry. I have no idea why I'm being how do I get rid of that? All right, I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to go back. So we're going to go back.
And so, Adam, your question, I see a question in the chat, is a misdiagnosis lumped into medical errors? Has that question been answered to your satisfaction, or do you want more of an explanation?
No, that's a good question. It is one of the medical errors. It's a good question, and I think it represents 30% of medical error is missed or incorrect diagnosis. Good question.
And I'm sorry, just while we have a second, another question is, you said a lot of the older doctors are kind of weary about the assisted decision-making tools.
Yes.
And I mean, I'm just trying to put myself in their shoes. They have a piece of software telling them it's something. Now, they feel it's something else, so they're overriding, a suggestion. And what if they end up being wrong? Maybe they're worried about like the liability of that.
They are worried about the liability or being told that it's, something that they're not familiar with, or they don't, or they just don't believe it. I guess you could say, well, why don't they just go look everything up and get another take on it, which is what they should do. Again, that is constrained by time. I just realized that I probably skipped these slides because of this kooky problem. I'm gonna, is it okay if I just leave it like this? Can you see my screen? No. Let me just leave it like this with a sidebar, because for reasons that I can't explain, this happened to one of my students the other day. It doesn't advance well. So I'm gonna skip these two slides, which sort of gets at what you're saying, that the goal of decision support is to augment the physician's intelligence, if you will. I mean, in some ways, AI, as one of the students pointed out to me, should be thought of as augmented intelligence, where decision support presupposes that its recommendations make the person better than they would be without the recommendations. Charles Friedman brought forth this definition about 10 years ago. And if a physician can see it as an adjunct rather than prescriptive, then I think it will be easier for them to sign on to. And again, just to clarify, since these slides got skipped, the decision support has been defined many ways. Osheroff has many of the best definitions. But the key is obviously to improve healthcare delivery by enhancing decisions with targeted clinical knowledge, patient information, and other health information. And I think we're going to get to what I'm worried about later on in this talk when we think about the fact that it's got to enhance medical decisions, not to hinder them. And we're going to have some examples where that's the case. All right, let me move on and just scroll this way because I don't like the scrolling issue. So lastly, in the decisions, in the clinical support, we have links to guidelines. We have an outstanding library. These are all computerized. It's not quite at the, asking Siri what the most recent guideline is for treating diabetes, but it's getting close to that. The resources are spectacular. They're computerized. PubMed has now much better engines for matching your query with what the information they give you. So all of that has been very helpful in advancing medical care, and it's saving a lot of time. Let me move on to the issues that I think are the activities that really do require a machine. And I've already talked about diagnosis, but we'll say a few words. So you can imagine a diagnostic tool could be either active, where I sit in front of the machine and I type stuff in. I put in signs and symptoms, and then the tool provides a list of diagnoses. That obviously has the downside of me actually having to type stuff in, which is a hurdle. I think a more interesting and probably more effective solution is for the machine to troll through all the data 24/7 and come up with guesses, post-test probabilities of various diseases, and identify patients who might have a disease that has yet been unrecognized by the providers. I have one example, but in the last year, there are many more examples. So let's talk about active tools. This is Isabel, where it's commercially available. The library here at Columbia has a subscription. The medical students are using it. Basically, the user types in signs and symptoms, and then the machine, using a sophisticated statistical methodology, comes up with what we call a differential diagnosis. These are all diseases that this patient might have given these signs and symptoms. Some of them are a little far-fetched or not very specific, like renal failure. But the first one here is primary adrenal insufficiency, which is a really good guess. And what I really love about this is, besides the fact that this app has been shown, published in New England Journal of Medicine, published the work showing that it improves diagnostic accuracy. And for reasons that are complex, it's not used widely, or not used widely enough. But here at Columbia, we have it. And what Columbia did was to map the output here with the best resources available. So if you were to click primary adrenal insufficiency, it would, and then click Dynamed, it would take you to the discussion in Dynamed, which is like a great textbook of that condition. Or you could search PubMed, or you could look at case reports. You could do Google Images. You could do Micromedics, which is a drug compendium. So it's a fabulous resource. The medical students are using. It's probably not that useful for the run-of-the-mill conditions, but in the emergency room, where often diseases that are undiagnosed appear, patients with undiagnosed diagnosis appear, it could be really useful. The other approach, which I've mentioned, is let the machine do the diagnosing while everybody is, asleep or not at the hospital, or not being seen actively by the provider. Let the machine identify patients with particular illnesses. And this is, for those of you who have computer background, this is pretty easy for diseases that are characterized by structured data. It's computationally simple. We have one measurement to determine if a patient has kidney disease. That's easy for a machine to figure out if the patient has kidney disease. Liver disease, we have a couple tests. Anemia, the machine can say this patient's anemic, their blood count is too low. I assure you there is a percentage of patients who are anemic who don't even know they're anemic because nobody's paid attention to their blood counts. Thyroid disease. So these are just some examples. And this actually we built several years ago into the computer decision support tool. It looks at the structured data. I mentioned it looks at the creatinine, which measures kidney function. It's got some demographics which play into the formula. Does a calculation, classic rule-based, no fancy algorithms, calculates kidney function. And then if the kidney function is below a certain value, it will prompt the provider that the patient has kidney disease. And we did a study several years ago where we showed that about a quarter of the patients with kidney disease, the machine knew the patient had kidney disease. A quarter of those patients had absolutely no mention of their kidney disease in their chart, nor were they receiving optimal therapy. Now that's fine for structured data where the machine is looking for a value. But what about a more complicated situation where the only marker of the patient's illness are notes and signs and symptoms written in notes? There's no test initially for multiple sclerosis. It's basically you only test for it after you suspect it. So we reasoned a couple of years ago that the machine could look for all those signs and symptoms. I happen to have mentioned these previously on my slide of the EHR being the only entity that knew what's wrong with the patient. So the machine looked for the signs and symptoms of multiple sclerosis, and then it extracted them using natural language processing. And then we created a simple classification algorithm that had pretty high predictive value. If the machine thought you had multiple sclerosis, there was a pretty good chance that the patient had multiple sclerosis. And we showed that 2 years before any provider wrote the patient has multiple sclerosis, the machine had a hunch. Again, we're getting back to how do you inform a provider? You don't want to tell them the patient has multiple sclerosis. You simply want to suggest that it's worth looking into because of the signs and symptoms. So these tools, since we published the paper, there probably have been another 10 studies using the same approach to look for all sorts of chronic and acute conditions, including suicidal ideation. People who contemplate committing suicide often have told their providers certain using key words, hopeless, feel bad about myself, etc. And then colleagues at different institutions have used the technique to make a prediction as to whether or not the patient's likely to try to commit suicide.
You have a question in the chat, which is, to what extent is utilization of clinical decision support a design issue?
Oh, that's a really, really good question. I would say it's totally underrated, and it's probably a very important aspect of decision support. I was asked to review a paper on treating diabetes, managing diabetes using decision support. And when I wrote, back to the editor, I said the way the tools were designed is so variable that if an intervention succeeded or not, one could not conclude that it was on the basis of the intervention alone. It had to include the design. And so it's a great question, absolutely a key. I think the designs are getting better, although you saw the snapshot of the Epic, it's still pretty grim. But designs are getting better. And I think that's actually one thing that startups have to offer, that they spend a lot of time on design. So I agree with your comment that the design is a key issue. And actually, you'll see some of these, the design is pretty poor. Briefly, imaging diagnostic tools are very popular now. Somehow we're doing very well in imaging. Here's a tool that's being used now around the country. It can diagnose, train on hundreds of thousands of patients with diabetic eye disease, and now can screen for diabetic eye disease. And so the workflow is the patient gets the screen, and then if looks suspicious, then the patient goes to the eye doctor, but doesn't go directly to the eye doctor. I think the only people who are disappointed are the eye doctors, because that was sort of the bread and butter part of their practice, was to screen people. The algorithm is spectacular. And certainly that's been shown true of diagnosing lung cancer. Mammograms are still a challenge. The algorithms haven't done that well. But skin lesions, finding melanoma, decision support accuracy has been outstanding. This is a perfect example of poor design, but it is an attempt at showing evidence-based management. The evidence-based guidelines are buried in this tool. So when you choose something to do or look into, it will tell you what the evidence is. This is up at Partners. Partners had a fantastic EHR, which they scrapped for Epic, sadly. But this is a way that you could bury those guidelines into the tool. Visualization, again, this is not a great example now that I'm looking at it, but it's very helpful for a snapshot. I can see the trend. I can see this guy's going up. I can see this guy's going up. This is trending down. It gives you an immediate appreciation of the time course of a patient. That's very important in terms of treating a patient, as figuring out where they're going and where they came from. The prediction, I've already mentioned. It's not possible for a provider to look at 100 attributes and say, well, I think the patient's going to do well or not. And this is another partner's invention. They put in all the signs and symptoms. It automatically extracts data from the electronic health record, and then it comes with a predictive risk. 5-year risk of kidney failure is 1.9%. Now, what you do with that, obviously, is up to the physician. But my point is that only a machine can create a predictive model based on all those attributes. Since I put this in my talk, I've since come to realize that I think there are over 30 published predictive models for kidney disease coming from 30 different institutions, including our own. And we all more or less come up with the same algorithm. Some of the attributes are heavily weighted and others unexpectedly are not. Now, here's something that every time I give this talk, I hope that somebody in the audience is going to say they want to do this as a project. But where I think a machine, and only a machine, can accomplish this, I tried to get IBM interested in this, but they weren't interested in this, is finding the best the outcome choice, the best decision choice. So this is a classic decision tree. And imagine a patient comes into my office and they have high blood pressure. And I ask myself, should I give them drug 1 or drug 2? We have different classes. We probably have 10 different classes of drugs. So I think to myself, well, drug 1 has a certain probability of being effective. Not every drug is effective in every patient. And there's a probability assigned. And the same would be true of drug 2. So right off the bat, we have 2 different probabilities of effectiveness for the 2 drugs. And then for each drug, there's at least 1, probably more, serious associated adverse event. And again, not everybody's going to get that adverse event. Some patients are prone to adverse events, others are not. So for each adverse event, and we're just assuming here that there's only 1 serious one, there's a probability associated with it that's published. So with each of these combinations, you could have 8 different outcomes. You could have the patient who takes an effective drug and has no adverse event. That's great. Let's say the adverse event is preventing heart attacks. And you might have another patient on drug 2, which is not that effective and suffers an adverse event. So it would be nice for the machine to be able to look at all the variables know what the probability is, and then, if possible, take into account these other complexities. This is my mother-in-law's bag of medicine. She's no longer with us, but she used to give me permission, through HIPAA, to show this to my students. Basically, she's got 15 medicines in there. She needed every single one. So how do I make this decision? She actually did develop high blood pressure, later in her life. How do you decide between drug 1 and drug 2 using 4 probabilities and 8 outcomes when the patient's also taking all these drugs? And we now know, as I've said repeatedly, they're drug-drug interactions. They're comorbidities, drug-disease interactions. You have a certain drug, you're going to respond poorly. They're pharmacogenomics, which we're just at the start of, that maybe you're a slow metabolizer of one of these drugs. And there are demographic and aspects that would play into it. So I don't know when we're going to get to this stage. I imagine this is going to take years before we get to the point where the machine suggests, getting back to the theme of telling and suggesting, suggests what the best choice might be given all of this. Then we can decide whether or not that fits our patient. Precision medicine is another example where it's going to be incorporated into decision support, and that's obviously beyond human capability. We need a machine to read all the reports. We need to know what the genes are and provide recommendations for how to deal with patients with particular genetic profiles. This has actually been worked on by our geneticists here at Columbia. We have a group that is looking at the genetics of kidney disease. and they're developing specific recommendations based on the gene that is abnormal in that particular patient. I think the same is going to be true soon for pharmacogenetics. There are 4 different genes that are responsible for hypersensitivity to the cholesterol-lowering drugs. It will still take a while. So I'm looking forward to all these interventions helping us practice better medicine. So here's sort of the list of things that we've gone over. And let me just end, and I really should put, add the design to this, but let me just start off with Osheroff's 5 rights. For the decision support to be effective, it's got to, at the very least, it's got to provide the right information. That sounds silly, but a lot of times you get a prompt for something that you don't really need to know at that point. It's got to go to the right person. It may end up being that you get a drug-drug interaction prompt and it's going to the wrong person, not the person who prescribed it 2 months ago. It's got to be in the right format. Should it be maybe this is where design fits in. A couple of years ago, one of the students worked on a text app that would text the provider about a seriously abnormal lab value. I mean, the provider was a resident, a young person who does a lot of texting, and the format and the channel was through texting. It was much better than email. It was much better than flashing something on a screen. And it's got to be at the right time. And this is, again, obvious, but I don't want to get a prompt for a vaccine 3 months before the patient comes and sees me. I'm not going to remember that. When I'm open the chart, that's when I want to see the prompt. All this takes, a lot of programming, but it is the key to success. So let me start the last part of my talk. See how I'm doing on time. I guess I'm okay. I'm worried about a lot of things. I have to say, I was an early adopter, was totally gung-ho on decision support, and still am. Huge amount of potential. But there's some serious concerns which I'd like to talk about. And the concerns I'm going to talk about are inaccuracy, unintended consequences, biased algorithms, and I end on a really negative note, which is fraud and bribery. Maybe I've been teaching about drug interactions too long, but there is the potential for fraud and bribery. We're going to talk about that at the end. So inaccuracy, I thought you might get a kick out of this. This is LinkedIn. I got an email. Herbert Chase got an email. And the subject said, "Do you know Herbert Chase?" And then said, "Herbert, staying in contact of, such a variable contact." So it was asking me if I knew me. Now, besides the existential angst that I got from thinking about, well, maybe I really don't know myself and I've got to drill down and meditate. That's a mistake. That's easy to fix. And if you get it in LinkedIn, big deal. Nobody got hurt. If you didn't prescribe the wrong medicine because it was inaccurate. And if you look at your apps, I'm sure you've noticed, there are a whole bunch of inaccuracies. Google Maps has my driveway, which is behind me. It's got the wrong turn. So these gigantic trucks delivering things end up at my neighbors and then can't make a U-turn. But, at the end of the day, nobody got hurt. Inaccuracy in decision support is completely unacceptable and is a reason to never use it. I think that's one of the things that startups don't see. How important it is to be completely accurate. So let's talk about inaccuracy in a decision support tool. This would be a typical diabetes support tool. We have these. As I mentioned, I just reviewed a paper that reviewed 50 of them, some of them from 2006, which made no sense to me because it was so rudimentary at that time. And it's a simple rule-based tool. If the patient has diabetes mellitus and a lab value greater than a certain percent, tell the provider the patient's diabetes control is not optimal. Well, how does the machine know if the patient has diabetes mellitus? It goes to a list of codes, a list of disease codes. Every patient in our care everywhere in the United States has a table that looks like this with a date and a code. It's a little dated, it's ICD-9 code. And diabetes happens to be one of these codes. So if the patient has diabetes, that code appears in their table. So the machine, the easiest thing for the machine to do is to go to the table and see if the patient has diabetes. Then, if so, it looks for the lab value that's part of the tool. And if the patient's had it, the machine can look at the lab value with a rule and then decide whether or not the patient's control is optimal. This is classic rule-based clinical decision support. It's easy, but it all depends on making sure the patient actually has diabetes. And so there is inaccuracy. For those of you who were on this call earlier, Matt and I were discussing coding and the problems with coding. It is well known that coding for patients' diseases is inaccurate. And for diabetes care, we worry about the false negatives. The CDS will miss patients who actually have diabetes and should have an intervention because the machine doesn't have, the table doesn't have their ICD code for diabetes. And we may get false positives. The machine will falsely target patients without diabetes who should not have an intervention. So it's interesting that this has not been measured all that frequently, but it's one of the reasons why we're so slow to implement a decision support tool, because we want to make sure that this doesn't happen. And it's not always the case that we can assure that, but that is a key, and inaccuracy is still a major challenge in the electronic health record. So let's look at unintended consequences. Getting back to Charles Friedman's initial point, a person working in partnership with an information resource is better than that same person unassisted. That's only true if there's no change in the workflow and the routine. And the problem is informatics is about question on design. Informatics is more about people than it's technology. We've got this artifact in front of us and then a human is using it. And we really have to understand how that interaction is going to play out. Otherwise, we're going to have either useless decision support tools or tools that do things that we don't want them to do. And the major conclusion or point, I think, is you can't predict in advance how something is going to play out. And as I'll say later, we just don't test enough in our field, and that you really need to see how people are interacting with the tool. So let's talk about unintended consequences. That would be where you did not test adequately, and what you thought was a great idea ended up being a terrible idea. So I think my first example is the tool that disrupts workflow. So this is a tragic story at the University of Pennsylvania that wanted to implement a commercially sold computerized physician order entry system. And it had, the rationale was great. I'm going to type in the order. I'll make sure that I spelled everything correctly. You'll be able to read my prescription. The machine can tell me if there's an interaction. It makes total sense that it's much better to be electronic than on a piece of paper. So the workflow changed though. And what happened is the children who had to go to the pediatric ICU, they were being flown in by helicopter. And the prior system, paper, the nurse on the helicopter would sort of telephone the nurses in the ICU and say, draw up this drug and that drug and this drug and that drug. And when the patient comes in, immediately give that drug for X, Y, and Z. With the new system, in order to make it computerized, the helicopter had to land, everybody had to get off, and the parents had to go sit at a computer with the intake person and go through all those questions that I'm sure you've had experience with in order to register the family in the computer in order for the physician to prescribe the medicines electronically. And as a result of that time delay, I can't remember what it was, it could have been hours, it's estimated that over 50 children died as a result of the implementation. Now, why they chose to test out the system in using an ICU is beyond me. I don't think they explained that. So that was a poor choice to begin with. But my point is, it's Charles Friedman's point, is you can't tell in advance what's going to happen, and it has to be tested in a ethical way. Unintended consequences. I just bragged about the drug-drug interaction prompts, which I think are outstanding. Most of the time, they're ignored. I don't know, the way you erase texts and emails from people, you just go click, 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 click. there's an epidemic of ignoring alerts. It's called alert fatigue. And it's not just drug-drug interactions. Do you want to be prompted to give the vaccine, if you got it and the machine didn't figure that out yet, if you gave the vaccine? So David Bates at Harvard did a brilliant study where they guesstimated, there's a fair amount of guessing here, but it's based on solid data, that every year there are about 5 million medication-related alerts that might have been inappropriately overwritten. I think that's the problem with cognitive overload. If the machine alerts you 99 times out of 100 about something that you either know or it's not a big deal, and one of them ends up being really serious, and you're just overloaded and you ignore that, then that can have serious consequences. So they did this study, and they estimated that approximately 200,000 adverse drug events resulting in hospitalization or death resulted from overriding the alerts, costing about $1 billion. So I mean, aside from the tragedy of the patients experiencing these unnecessary adverse events and the fact they could have prevented, there's a huge cost to society. So this is a real problem. We're working on an alert right now with Epic, and we're totally paranoid about alert fatigue, and we're trying to think of ways to not overburden get their attention, but not contribute to cognitive overload. I think one of you alluded to this, but this one is particularly worrisome. We have all these great clinical support tools, and they often are around for a long time. The problem is that sometimes they stop working, for want of a better description. A lot of you have probably programmed in your courses, and I'm sure you've had the experience that all of a sudden the program doesn't work, and you have to go figure out why, and a link got broken, or you typed a letter in the middle of a command. So Adam Wright, at the time he was at Harvard, he did this great study, scary but interesting study, where they showed that there were a whole bunch of alerts that no longer fired because they had been disabled, or the guidelines had changed, or the rules had malfunctioned. There are all sorts of reasons, and nobody is really watching that. So, a corollary to this is that I will be likely to forget to try to remember that I need to give the patient a vaccine. I'm just going to wait to be prompted to give the vaccine. And that's where I really am subject to the problems of the rule breaking. That there's over-reliance. I'm going to rely, once you start relying on the machine to do things for you, then if it doesn't work, obviously that's a major problem. And I'm not sure what the solution to this is. It just means there needs to be meticulous attention to every single alert. The kidney dashboard, somebody had to oversee that to make sure it was up to date and it still worked. So here are just a couple of things that I've already mentioned. Vaccination reminders. An unintended consequence might be multiple flu vaccinations. If the alert doesn't stop firing. There was a study done several years ago where one patient had, in a calendar year had 15 flu vaccines because the alert kept firing and different providers kept giving the flu vaccine. Alert fatigue, the diagnostic tools can result in over-testing. You saw that list from Isabel, probably 10 different things there. Some of those are very rare, unlikely, but if the provider is worried, that will over-test. I've already mentioned history summarization. It's been shown by my colleague that if I look at that screenshot of what's wrong with the patient, the next day I have no recollection really of what's wrong with that patient, or have a vague recollection. Very different, very superficial knowledge. In most cases, if that's emergency room, maybe that's fine. But if you have to take care of somebody in any serious way, you really need to know in depth what's wrong with them. So let me just tell you what I have recommended, or we've all recommended, that you need to do adequate testing. There's this concept called clinical equipoise, where you can't implement something or give somebody a drug unless you're absolutely uncertain about whether or not the drug or the application is going to help or hurt. I mean, otherwise it would be unethical. If you knew that it was going to cure everybody, it'd be unethical to withhold it. And if you knew it was going to harm people, then it would be unethical to use it. So the whole ethical basis of our drug studies and randomized controlled trials is equipoise. And it's the ethical basis. Well, we don't do that in clinical decision support. We don't, because we're overly optimistic, we don't necessarily think about all the unintended consequences. And we don't do adequate testing. And I think the example of the ICU is a good example. Maybe in the future, we'll have simulation. There's great pilot simulation for pilots. There's also a simulation for surgeons. Maybe that's the way to approach this, that you simulate a decision support tool and then you see what the impact is. But we're not there now, and it's a real problem. We sit around and say, wow, this is a really great idea if we do X, Y, and Z. And we don't really think about the unintended consequences until we observe them. So we need to test, and authentic testing needs to be monitored for impact. I've just said it. You need to test with real users, not informatics cognoscenti like me and Matt. I mean, we're kind of geeky. And so we'll look at not to malign Matt, but I'll say I'm geeky. Whereas we'll look at a poorly designed decision support tool and say, yeah, that's pretty cool. That works well. We need a real user. My primary care provider told me 5 or 6 years ago that he's a young man. He's several decades younger than I am. He said, if he's forced to give up paper, he's going to retire. So since then, there's been several major articles appearing in the Times and New England Journal of Medicine and JAMA on this increased rate of retirement of people his age because they can't stand the electronic health record, and it's completely disrupted the way they practice medicine. And over the summer, I got a letter from him saying he's retiring. It didn't say why, and I didn't think it was my business to ask him why, but I suspect that he felt that he could not practice medicine in the way he's used to. And so he's the one you need to test these interventions to make sure you don't overload his cognitive space and make the alerts really meaningful and get rid of the ones that aren't. Here is another class of concerns. See, now we're moving to the algorithmic development of clinical decision support. And that opens 3 concerns for me. Black box, what's happening inside that algorithm? What's it doing? Bias and fraud and bribery, as I mentioned before. So let's talk about black box. I'm sure you've heard the term. It's basically an artificial intelligence system whose inputs and operations are not visible to the user. The retina algorithm that figured out if the patient had diabetes in the eye, diabetic retinopathy. We have no idea of what the machine picked up on. We like to think that it was the way the blood vessel looked, but for all we know, it was some pixel that was next to some other pixel that, in combination had a certain level of intensity. We have absolutely no idea. And nor could, especially if it was neural networks, nor could the developers explain to us how those pixels were integrated into a algorithm. So as a result of that, many of my colleagues completely reject out of hand algorithms that are black box. They say, I don't know what it's doing, I'm not using it. And I find that to be dispiriting because a lot of those algorithms, like the retina algorithm, are unbelievably good and have a performance that's better than tired human beings and junior faculty. But it occurred to me, does it actually matter if we can't explain how the machine built the model? I mean, maybe it doesn't matter. So what? So I can't explain how the retina model works. All I care about is how accurate it is. And hello, let's go here. And when you think about it, much of medical therapy is based on what we don't know and can't explain. In fact, the entire history of medical practice is based on observations and interventions, the cause or explanation of which we have absolutely no idea. And just as I was trying to think of silly is not quite the right word, the most impressive example of that is 1,000 years ago in China, the dried skin of toads was successfully used to treat congestive heart failure. I have no idea of how that came about. Here, try this. But the fact is, the performance is outstanding. And we had no explanation until the late 20th century. Now we know what's in the dried skin of toads. It's basically digitalis, which is used for heart failure, or not much anymore. And we also only lately did we know how digitalis work. So I thought maybe the black box, is not the right black box to worry about, because we don't need to explain it. In my mind, the black box to worry about are those that don't report the accuracy. So the question asked is not how does it work, is how well does it perform? And the problem is the black box is now being developed by proprietary companies like Epic, and they don't report performance. They don't report performance, which honestly, shame on us for using it. I mean, when I finally realized that, I'm now working with a clinical decision support committee who oversees Epic, but how could we activate a tool without knowing how well it worked? So I had the following conversation with medical students last month when one of them did a sepsis paper. And they said, oh, we have a sepsis alert system in Epic. And I said, well, what do? Do you send the patient to the intensive care unit? Sepsis is, systemic infection. You need to go to the intensive care unit. And the students said, no, everybody just ignores the alert. The residents say, well, just forget about it. I thought that is sort of bad informatics, that you have an alert that nobody pays any attention to. Just get rid of it. It's just ruining your day by having another alert. Why is it in there in the first place? And then it occurred to me that what's the accuracy? And it's not published because it's proprietary. So I actually contacted our safety officer, and they're about to do that study, because we can measure here at Columbia what the accuracy of that is by looking at outcomes. It ended up about a month later, a group in Michigan did just that. They took the Epic algorithm and they measured the accuracy. And shockingly, but not unexpectedly, they showed that the sensitivity was 33%, meaning 67% of the cases of patients with sepsis were missed by the algorithm. And they had 17% false positives. Almost 20% of the patients ended up going to the ICU when it was a false positive. So who on earth would use this algorithm? And I'm hoping at some point down the line we just get rid of it. But Epic has tons of these. I mean, I don't know the number. I'm guessing in our EHR, there are probably at least 20 different algorithms, and we have absolutely no idea what the performance is. So that's the black.
As well, you have two new questions in the chat.
Yeah.
One is do the decision support tools require FDA approval?
They are under theoretically, the FDA has to approve them. And now that you mention it, quite honestly, I don't know if that includes performance. I think it's under the rubric of devices. When you get FDA approval for a device, you just have to show that it's safe, not that it works. This is different for drugs. You have to show that it works. So again, I'm winging it here because I don't know the answer, and I will go look that up. But it's conceivable, since decision support is under devices, it doesn't necessarily have to show that it works. So I'll look into that, but I don't think it requires performance.
And the other question is how risk averse are we to implementing clinical decision support? So will we implement, for example, a clinical decision support algorithm that we don't entirely understand?
I think it depends on what the goal of the tool is and what the performance is. If it's a predictive model, if the prediction is the performance is poor, then even if we have no idea of how it came up with that model, if it's, we're not going to use it simply because it's a poor performance. If it's got a stellar performance, I don't think it matters if we understand how the machine came to that realization. There's a caveat to that, of course, because if there's bias built into the training set, then the performance may be great in one group of people, but not another. So that we'll get to bias in a second. But I think maybe the way to think about this also is initially when EHRs became universal and there was the possibility of support tools, there was incredible positivity. You know, we're all anchored to a positive influence. Now we've got to reverse that and be paranoid and suspicious and be weary of what's being developed out there. And that's hard because we need support and we're all, you know, optimistic, but we also have to be really careful about accepting some of these tools. I mean, these are good questions, and I am wondering how we go about turning on some of Epic's tools. So that gets me to bias. The questions are great. Please keep sending them to Matt. There are the algorithms, and there's a lot of press now, belatedly. This was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. They had a review of sort of in 7 different disciplines, OBGYN, urology, internal medicine, surgery, predictive algorithms that were used in managing care that ended up showing bias. And that ultimately, I found this to be interesting and actually surprised that the bias always, in every case, resulted in worse care for non-white patients. Now, you could have argued that maybe on a statistical basis, you know, it should have benefited, or the bias could have gone in both directions, but it didn't. So this review is called Hidden in Plain Sight. Just one example was that the bias was introduced in a training set to figure out who has serious heart failure and who needed to be managed more aggressively, and ended up the Black and Latinx patients who presented to a Boston emergency room whose results were put through the heart failure algorithm were less likely than white patients to be admitted to a cardiology service. And I think one of the things that was disturbing about their reports is that in many cases, when the authors went back to the groups that developed the algorithms, they themselves, the algorithm developers, actually couldn't remember or didn't know why race was included and weren't even aware that they had trained on a limited set of patients. This is a kidney. We're back to the kidney. I showed you this before. Here's the calculation. Race is included in this calculation. And, you know, where did that come from? And there was initially a sense that for young men of typical size, probably had slightly higher creatinine levels because of that increased muscle mass if they were African American. So initially that was included in the calculation in order to discount that. Their measurement of their kidney function, creatinine was a little bit elevated, but it wasn't because their kidney was not functioning, it's because of their muscle mass. Well, that's only true for young, big men. It's not true for Mrs. Smith, who's 80 years old. She's in a nursing home. She's African American. She weighs 96 pounds. And by including race, it meant that her calculated kidney function would be inappropriately higher than it actually was. And so her care was going to be suboptimal. So the societies now, in the kidney societies, are actively discussing this. They're going to get rid of it. That's just one example. At least we knew where this came from, and we can make better estimates by eliminating it, having a better training set, and changing the formula. These are just two other examples. There was the insurance industry apparently uses some algorithms to figure out how sick a patient is. How sick is this person? I know it sounds vague, but it gives you some idea of insurability and where they're going to end up in the hospital. So the algorithm uses, well, what's a proxy for being sick? And they reason that a proxy would be how much money was spent on the patient's healthcare. If you're sicker, more money is spent on you than if you're not as sick, less money is spent on you. That made total sense, except for the fact that patients, non-white patients, especially of low socioeconomic status, didn't get a lot of healthcare because they didn't have access, they didn't have insurance, so they could be equally sick, but much less money would be spent on them. And so you couldn't use money spent as a measure of how sick somebody was because of all these other considerations. And again, it ended up that the non-white patients were considered less sick because less money was spent on them. And as a result of that, they got less, had fewer benefits from the healthcare system, visiting nurse service, drug discounts, because they weren't considered as sick. And the last obvious one, there are a lot of examples in this. This is sort of an old one from Steve Lohr at the Times. If you train on an unrepresentative sample, whether it's all white patients, this article is on facial recognition. It's really inaccurate unless you're a white guy. And that's still the problem. Apple and Facebook are dealing with some of their recommendations, and that's still in the works. So I think although the black box, I've already stated, only depends on its accuracy and predictive abilities, but it is affected by what it trains on. And maybe, which you do know before it gets to the algorithm, and maybe that's the point, that a very unbiased sample needs to be trained on, or it's trained on a subset, and the algorithm only applies to that subset. So let me end with fraud and bribery. Maybe I've been giving this lecture on pharma too many years, but fraud and bribery are rampant in pharma, and they still are. Vioxx was a drug that caused heart attacks. It's like Advil, but it's super duper strong, caused heart attacks, and the pharma company that actually was doing the studies pulled the patients who had heart attacks from their data set. So they testified on the benefits of the drug, and they had a much lower rate of heart attacks because they pulled that data. Baycol is a drug to lower cholesterol. It's just like other statins, Crestor, Lipitor, your parents have probably taken them. The inner circle knew that patients were dying from Baycol, but they didn't pull the plug. And there are Alzheimer's drugs that are still used that have absolutely no therapeutic benefit and put the patients at risk for potentially life-threatening adverse events. So, when I started giving this lecture years ago, I anticipated that fraud and bribery would eventually find its way into decision support. So here's an example of bribery. It's painful to me because I actually have practice fusion. This is well designed, apropos of our conversation before design. It's easy to use. It's my own sort of at-home electronic health record that I use for various activities. And I was horrified to see that after Practice Fusion, which was a startup, they sold them, so they got bought by Allscripts. And it ended up that Allscripts was receiving money to sponsor payments to steer the doctors to a particular drug. And of all the drugs to steer them to, it was opiates. An explosion a catastrophic number of young people dying from opioids and getting hooked on it. And that was what they decided to pay Practice Fusion for, which was to steer the provider to opiates. And they had to settle with 145 million. That was peanuts in my mind. So they bribed the doctors. This still goes on. I mean, if you go to a GI conference and they bring lunch, pharma, or the CDC guy, the Allstrips guy brings lunch. I mean, that's bribery too. So this is why I give a lecture on conflicts of interest to the graduate students later on in the month. So bribery is, in the future of this field, and I think it has me worried. Imagine the decision support tool if there was one for multiple sclerosis. You could imagine that Practice Fusion might have put in start drug. Maybe that's the right thing to do, and maybe it's not. And a provider has earned the right through hard work to make that decision themselves. And if it's recommended by a tool, then that's a problem, or it could be a problem. So I'd like to make a distinction between what I would call academic development and corporate development. Academic development is a university activity. It's for the benefit of the patient, and it's guided by ethical principles of the medical profession. Every single medical student, dental student, nursing student takes an oath, basically, and that they will be guided by ethical principles, do no harm, give the patient the right to make their own decisions. It's drilled into your head. And at the end of the day, we only want to do what's best for the patient. And we self-monitor. We have conferences, people get kicked out of the profession for, lose their license for doing bad things. Corporate development is, and I don't think I'm being particularly pessimistic here, but it's really for the benefit of the shareholders and venture capital. Their first concern is return on investment. And I know this because I've been a consult for IBM and for several startups. That's the first thing they do is raise money, even before they have a good idea, or they have an idea that they think is good and ends up not being very good. They're not obligated by ethical concerns. They don't have it drilled into their head that the patient comes first and you do no harm. And there's certainly no way to monitor this. I will look into the FDA point made previously, but they're not going to self-monitor. In fact, it's the opposite of that. And the realization, of course, is healthcare is a major space to invest in. Literally, trillions of dollars are spent on healthcare. So my only point here is that we have to remind ourselves that we need, when we look at decision support, that we need to make sure that we're abiding by the ethical principles that we grow up on. Conclusions, we can't achieve optimal care without clinical decision support. But I like to think of it, as we've discussed, that's really augmented intelligence. The machine is going to recommend things to me. I think one of you brought up the point about liability. Every time I gave a talk at an IBM conference, somebody raised their hand and said, is IBM liable? I mean, can they be sued for a support tool? And I say, the purpose of the tool is to provide the provider with the information, but not necessarily tell the provider what to do. Give me the guidelines, give me the decision, the best decision based on what you know, and then I, with my patient, will decide. Augment my intelligence. So to that extent, you could even argue the opposite. If a provider does not use Isabel and misses a diagnosis, then who's to blame, Isabel or the provider? Decision support must be designed to enhance, not hinder medical practice. And right now, it's doing both. In fact, I'm not even sure where the scale is. I'm almost thinking that it hinders medical practice more than it enhances at this point. But I'm not sure anybody's actually measured that. And it's got to reduce, not increase the cognitive burden. Right now, the burden is just skyrocketing. I did see a report yesterday that some brilliant scientists at MIT are working on an algorithm that kind of takes all the data in the EHR and really reduces the number of cognitive elements in order for the provider to function and focus on the really important issues. Performance of the decision support interventions must be reported before being deployed. Again, I'm horrified that we had that sepsis prompt without knowing how well it performed. And I will follow up on that. And then if the prompt is deemed reliable and it's been tested, then users must follow the recommendations. Only after evidence of utility and safety, but why would you ignore a potentially lethal drug-drug interaction? We know why that happens, as I've explained, cognitive overload and all these alerts that are meaningless. But if we can get rid of all that background noise, then you really have to pay attention and do the thing that's being recommended. I think we've achieved the learning objectives, defining clinical support, discussing why it's needed, provide examples of successful tools, and lastly, to focus on the serious concerns about decision support. And thank you, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much. This was really fascinating. I see there are 2 questions in the chat. Maybe Diego and Courtney, do you want to just ask them directly now, those questions? It's maybe quicker.
Yeah, let's hear some voices.
Hi, Dr. Chase. So yeah, this is definitely not my first talk that I've heard from you. I used to be a medical student, so I know entirely what. Yeah.
You probably heard this talk.
Yeah. But I guess I just wanted to know, for new drugs, we have stages of clinical trials, right? First stage, second stage, third stage, and it's a long process, right, to get drugs approved. But I feel like for clinical decision supports, it's might be a little ironic, but do we have a system like that where we can actually test for things like long-term effects? Because I'm sure that a lot of clinicians and other decision makers are thinking, well, these clinical decision supports are there for a certain purpose. It's very direct, but they could have some deleterious effects, such as changing the psychology around decision making, or some sort of unintended effect. Is there any structure for that currently in place? I
think there's been a great interest in can you conduct a randomized controlled trial?
Right.
And that's hard because you're using the support tool and I'm not. And there's going to be fallout, and then I'll start. It won't be a clean experiment. And there are ways around it. There's before and after measurements, or there are different institutions. At Harvard, they do this, and at Columbia, they do that. There are ways to test this out. And I think there needs to be more focus on outcomes. And I am seeing more of that. As I mentioned, that review looked at all the glucose monitoring diabetes treatment protocols. But as far as I know, there isn't the same rigorous phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. And part of it is it's hard to blind people. And also, I'm not sure that's part of the culture. When I went to my first AMI meeting 15 years ago, I heard talk after talk from junior faculty and postdocs who had a great idea, built it, and nobody used it. And I was struck with, well, you didn't, maybe you weren't fixing something that needed to be broken, that was broken, but maybe you didn't test it enough. And a couple of years ago when I went to the meeting, there were still those reports. So I think part of the testing requires focusing on what do we need, rather than this is a really great idea and then let's implement it. But I don't see a formalized path as you've suggested.
I see. Yeah, thank you. I mean, I just find it ironic that we have a difficulty making decisions about how to make decisions. So yeah, I think it would be interesting to see sort of a system where we can actually just push things through a pipeline where they can undergo some sort of rigorous testing, or at least, for drugs, they always say, well, does it work, right? And then those questions are eventually all answered. So I would imagine that something like that could be necessary for clinical decision supports, just because I think at least the people who make the decisions, the people up there, tend to be pretty risk averse or, hold liabilities. And so I would imagine that they want something in place that could just kind of guide their decisions to be backed up with all this evidence, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good point. I'm going to talk to the committee and try to get a read on how many Epic tools are being fired that whose performance has not been reported. I mean, when our doctors are really smart clinicians use a drug that Epic said, use this drug, and there was no report on how well the drug worked, using your analogy, absolutely not. It would have to have proved the test of time and, post-test marketing, what the side effects were, et cetera. So you raised a really important issue, and I think we really, right now, we're not thinking about those things. I mean, maybe other institutions are, but we're not.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, I had another question that I threw in the chat, but essentially it's kind of following on this topic. It seems like these, development of clinical decision support systems is just really shaped by these large vendors and their existing infrastructures and whatever they've previously built. So on the one hand, not only can they kind of go, it seems like unchecked in putting out there whatever they deem to be a good alert, but also like having worked on a research project, which was launching something within the Epic EHR, it felt like half the time we were working around what already existed because it just wasn't up to the standard of what was needed. So what as a field, what do we do about this? Because shouldn't these, I mean, you've explained the motivations and how they're fundamentally different, but like, how do we rectify this within our field? And, they shouldn't be a roadblock, right? Like they should be facilitating.
Totally agree. It's a really good point. I don't know what the political structure is of the oversight of Epic at Columbia. And I'm thinking of one example. Harvard Partners had a unbelievably good drug-drug interaction. I don't know if you.
I worked at MGH.
Oh, did you?
So, yeah.
Good for you. Fabulous. Were a small percentage of the alerts were overridden, but most of them people paid attention to. Then they scrapped their homegrown system, went to Epic, spent $2 billion, and the alert apparently is ineffective, so that 98% of them are ignored by the physicians.
Yep. Yeah.
So honestly, I don't know. Karthik, I think, it gives you a talk, and I'm not sure he does this. He talks a little bit about what the oversight of the different areas of the electronic system is, and maybe we just don't have enough oversight. I'm not sure we have a person who's in charge of Epic that oversees the different elements of it.
Yeah.
This is an administrative and political issue.
Yeah, for sure.
Good. Well, if you have any questions, email me. I'd be happy to continue the conversation. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the course.
Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Thank you.